Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, as today I'll be taking yet another look at one of the Marvel Legends Avengers 60th anniversary sets, and this week it is the turn of the Skrull Queen and the Super Skrull. This isn't the first time we've had a Super Skrull in the Marvel Legends line, but it is the first time we've had him in these duds, in this costume taken from Secret Invasion. We've never had a Skrull Queen specifically in the Marvel Legends line, so this is also something of a first, but we have had a few versions of Spider-Woman, and this is essentially what this figure is, but with a swappable head. Okay, so let's dive straight into this by looking at the packaging. Now, the packaging will look very familiar if you're watching any of my recent videos looking at this 60th anniversary wave of the Avengers, because it is the same design, layout, and branding. We have the two figures. These are both digital renderings of those action figures up front and centre. They look quite colourful and fun and well posed. There's an awful lot of white blank space in this packaging, which makes it bright, but it's not the most attractive. But in the background there, we do see a collage of different images taken from the comic series Secret Invasion. But all things taken into consideration, I think this is still pretty presentable. You can put this on your shelf or put it on a display somewhere, and it's going to look quite nice and eye-catching. Looking at the side panel, we can see that they've taken inspiration from the comic books here for the design, which is really cool. We can see various different elements taken from the Secret Invasion run. We can see the Super Skrull, the Skrull Queen, and the Spider-Woman there. This looks pretty cool. I think they've done a nice job of collaging these images together. If we turn to the opposite side panel, we can see they've got the two figures stacked on top of each other. So depending on your preference, if you're stacking these side by side on your shelf, then you can choose to keep a pretty consistent looking themed collection, which is pretty nice. And then finally, if we flip it and look at the reverse of the packaging, we have this really fun display of these figures in an action pose, which look really good. Particularly that Spider-Woman there, I think looks really cool and very attractive. I think they've done a really nice job. I actually think I prefer the reverse of the packaging of this series of 60th anniversary figures to the front of the packaging. It just has a lot more colour, just looks a lot more vibrant. It's just generally a lot more eye-catching. And in the background, of course, we have that collage of the various different members of the Avengers over the last 60 years. So this is really colourful, very eye-catching, as I said, and I think it's very displayable as well. The outer card packaging is very flimsy, it almost feels paper thin to be honest, but inside is a more robust, thicker card which contains the figures, and of course you can open that flap up to reveal the figures in their rice paper. I've mentioned on many videos, I'm not a huge fan of this approach. It's a little bit more complicated to get them back in packaging once they've been put on display, but hey. So let's start by taking a look at the Super Skrull. Now on the surface, this was the figure I was most excited about, but on reflection, it's probably the weaker of the two figures we'll be looking at today, and there's something a little bit underwhelming about this figure. Now, to be fair, the sculpting is pretty good, it's pretty accurate. I really like this head sculpt. It definitely looks distinctively different to what we've had previously, and I really like the overall look and design they've gone for. The expression on the face there looks really mean and nasty the way it should be, and I think they've got the proportions right on the ears, and the overall presentation looks really good. So I think they've done a nice job here. I think I would have liked a little bit more shading, particularly around the chin to make those ridges come out a little bit more, but otherwise, this looks absolutely fine. Most of the pieces used for this body have been recycled from other figures. For the most part, that's absolutely fine. The overall size and proportion are pretty accurate for what we'd expect with the Super Skrull. He's a little bit larger, a little bit broader than most of the other figures in the Marvel Legends line, and this is absolutely fine. Where it's a little bit disappointing though is where they've painted in some details. As we can see in the gauntlets there, of course, that is just a black line against the green plastic, and it just looks a little bit cheap. This would have been much better if it had just been sculpted in there on that forearm. So it's a shame that we haven't got little details like that. However, we can see a little bit of new sculpting on the upper torso. We can see that Iron Man's arc reactor has been sculpted in there, and it makes all the difference. It adds a little bit more depth and texture and helps make the figure feel more authentic and more individual. Another disappointment for me though is the real lack of shading and washes running through this figure. What we're presented with is a figure in its base mould plastic, and there's no real paint apps utilised anywhere on this figure, which is a real shame. A little wash here would just really help draw out some of these details, and there seems to be an increasing trend that we're starting to see, which is a little bit disconcerting. I want to talk a little bit about the cape. Whilst it does look very cool, it's very distinctive to this Super Skrull, which is fantastic, the overall texture and design is not great. The material they've used is a very stiff plastic, there's not really an awful lot of flexibility, and the other major issue is that it does tend to feel a little bit flimsy as well. It just kind of hooks in there through a peg on the back of the cape into a slot on his back, and it just doesn't really really fit securely, so it does have a tendency to want to pop off and slide off far too easily. So this feels quite flimsy and unsatisfying. So let's look at articulation. There is a ball joint in the top of the neck, so he can spin his head from side to side. He can't really wobble it left and right though. He can move it up and down. There is plenty of room for manoeuvrability here, but it does feel a little bit limited by that chin and the back of the head. There's ball joints in the shoulders, so the arms will lift up and out. There is a complementary bicep swivel there as well as a double joint at the elbow, so you can get that forearm all the way back there, which is great. There is a pin swivel at the wrist, so that wrist will rotate all the way around, and of course it will hinge forwards and backwards as well. There is a straight swivel at the waist, so he can move from side to side, although this joint is starting to feel a little bit dated. There is an ab crunch as well at the top of the torso, so of course he can bend forwards and backwards. As I said, this feels a little bit outdated now. We've seen massively improved ball joints in torsos and figures lately, and I would like to see that a little bit more. There are ball joints, of course, in the hips. The legs will kick out to the side. There is another swivel at the top of the thigh there, as well as one at the very bottom of the leg, at the top of the boot cut as well. The legs will kick forwards, kick backwards. There's a double joint at the knee, so of course that lower leg will bend all the way backwards, which is great. And then there is an ankle pivot as well, so that foot will hinge forwards and backwards, and it will rotate from side to side. He's pretty light when it comes to accessories. He just comes with an additional pair of arms. Now these are superpower arms, which are quite cool. We see Iron Man's gauntlet, and of course we see Mr. Fantastic's stretch arm as well. And whilst these are pretty cool and definitely shake up his overall look, it does feel a little bit limiting. I wish they'd included some extra goodies in here, but sadly they didn't. So overall then, I have to say my final thoughts, I'm going to give this 3 stars. There's something very underwhelming and disappointing about this figure, in all honesty. It feels a little bit cheap and a little bit rushed out, like they've cut some corners to get him out to us. That's my overall takeaway with this, and I think that is achieved really through the lack of paint apps, the lack of washes running over this figure, but also some of the joints he's got as well feel a little bit rubbery in places, and as I said, the cape feels very, very flimsy. So overall, I'm underwhelmed, I think is the best way to describe this. This isn't a terrible figure by any stretch of the imagination. The overall look is pretty cool, and his accessories are limited but fun. And I think, if you want to add this version of the Super Skrull to your collection, and why wouldn't you, then they've done a pretty decent job all in all. But as I said, it doesn't feel like they've really thought this through and given this much love and attention as it deserved. Okay, with that being said, let's look at the Spider-Woman, or the Skrull Queen, and I have to say things take a massive upswing here, and this is definitely the stronger figure of the two in my personal opinion. The head sculpt I think is pretty solid. All of the various elements are actually sculpted in, including her eye sockets, the bottom of the mask there, the triangle on the top of the head. These are all sculpted details, and they're all very nicely and accurately painted as well. So I think they've done a nice job here. If I was going to be critical, I would say that it's a shame that the hair doesn't have a wash running through it, some blue highlights maybe, or something like that, just to give it a bit more depth and texture, and just make it look a little bit more realistic, I suppose. As it is, it just feels very matte black. Of course, that hair is a rubber piece as well, and we have seen this used on several other figures in the past. But overall, I think they've done a pretty decent job. When it comes to the body sculpt, of course, we've seen all of these pieces recycled from other figures before. This tends to be the standard frame that they use for a lot of their female characters. The only element they tend to tweak is the actual chest piece. Other than that, this is pretty much recycled on every single female figure that we see. Once again, sadly, there's a real lack of shading on this figure to give it that texture, which we would like to see, in that a little bit more detail, which is unfortunate. But we do have some nice, strong visual paint apps when it comes to the yellow parts of this costume. Very defined black lines separating the yellow from the red as well, and I think this looks quite visually striking, and I think they've done a good job. One area of innovation though are the web wings, and these are separate plastic pieces that slot into the bicep, and they look really quite cool. They're made of a hard translucent plastic, and they catch the light quite nicely, give them a lot more depth and texture, which looks really quite cool. The individual spider webs are actually sculpted in, and I think this works really nicely because they've thought through the articulation as well, so that you can position this figure in any pose that you want without there being any hindrance caused by this web. And that's because, of course, that the upper web there is attached to the bicep and not the forearm, allowing that lower forearm to be posed however you want it to be without impacting the overall aesthetic. Looking at the articulation then, she does have a ball joint to the top of the neck, so she can move her head from side to side, and thankfully that hair will work with that. She can kind of wobble her head from side to side as well, and she's meant to be able to move her head forwards and backwards, but the hair will block this. Now she does have ball joints in the shoulders, so her arms will lift up and out. Again, we have another bicep swivel at the top there, and we have a lower forearm swivel as well. So a real shame that we didn't get the double joints that we've seen recently on some of the female figures, but this will suffice. So that of course will rotate all the way around. It will hinge to about 90 degrees as well. So a little bit limiting, but overall it's fine, it's functional. There is a pin swivel at the wrist of course, so that lower hand will rotate all the way around, and it will hinge forwards and backwards as well. Although do be careful, because of course this is quite a thin joint. Now she does have a ball joint in the top of the torso, so she can move from side to side, she can lean left and right, and she can bend forwards and backwards a pretty decent distance as well. There's ball joint to the hips, the legs will kick out to the side, there's that thigh swivel at the top of the leg there, the legs will kick forwards, backwards, and there is a double joint at the knee allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back there, which is great. And then finally we have another ankle pivot, so of course the foot will hinge forwards, backwards, and rock from side to side. In terms of accessories, she fares a little better than the Super Skrull. She comes with alternative closed wings, which is pretty interesting, and she also has these alternate spider sting hands and an alternate Skrull Queen head. This is a brand new sculpt, of course, we've not seen this before in the Marvel Legends line, and I think they've done a pretty nice job. So the sculpting looks pretty accurate to what we see in the comic books. I think they've got a great expression on the face, and there's some decent paint apps around the eyes and around the lips there. But again, I think it would have benefited from a little bit of a paint wash, particularly in the hair, and some shading around the ridges in the chin. I think there's a decent array of accessories here, allowing you to create a number of different looks for this particular figure, which is always fun. I think the addition of the closed wings is an interesting choice, probably not how I'm personally going to display it, but I do think that it's nice that they've bothered to include this and thought a little bit outside the box here. Now the sting hands, of course, we've seen used many times. We've seen it on Storm figures when it's lightning, for example, and it does tend to get recycled an awful lot. But I think it works, I think it does the job here, and I think it's quite colourful and adds that little bit of extra effect. And of course, you can mix and match the heads as well to create the various looks you want to create. So all in all, this is actually a pretty fun figure. I actually really quite like this one. I'm going to give it 4 stars, mainly because it is quite versatile. I have to say as well, I actually don't own a Jessica Drew, a Spider-Woman, so for me this was a welcome addition, and I think they've done a pretty nice job with this figure. It's a pretty nice rendition of that character, so for me the Skrull Queen element, that extra head, is the icing on the cake, it's the bonus. Is it worth the double dip if you've already got one though? I'm not sure, and that's kind of where I am with this figure set as a whole, because I think this is a set for die-hard fans only. I don't think you're going to feel great value for money in this set. It does feel like it's been rushed out a little bit. It certainly feels like it would have benefited from a few tweaks and a little bit more TLC. Now, if you're a huge fan of the Secret Invasion run from the comics, then you're probably going to want to snap it up, particularly if you don't already own a Spider-Woman. If you do own a Spider-Woman and you're not that worried about this specific version of the Super Skrull, then this could probably be an easy pass for you. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.